Hello, everybody. This is going to be a recreation of the first shiur in the series on Megillas Ruth that we started tonight. Unfortunately, I had some Zoom problems getting in, and so when I tried to click record the Zoom, it may have recorded, but I have no idea where it recorded to. I can't find the recording anywhere on my computer. I can't access it. So instead, I'm going to give, hopefully, a slightly shorter version of the same shiur, but right now, as an audio file. So this is going to be the first shiur, L'ilui Nishmas Avi Mori Pesach David ben Avraham Nata, in memory of my late father, Pieter, to whom I dedicated some of the Eicha Shiurim last July as well, when he was ill. He would have been the first one to come tonight and to cheer me on the Zoom, even though he would have grumbled that he hated Zoom and he would much rather have been in person. So the book of Ruth, very well known to everybody, the Megillas Ruth. We landed on Shavuos morning, 4 Perakim. We are going to try to do 30 minutes a night for 3 weeks and somehow miraculously finish the entire Sefer in 8 Psukim a night, which I did not make it through all 8 Psukim tonight, but we're going to try to do better. Once I finish, I started with an introduction, which I'll start with now. Dr. Yael Ziegler wrote a wonderful book called Ruth, published by the Koren Maggid Press. It's really very, very well done. And she says the book of Ruth is very much paired with the book of Shoftim, which took place at the same time contemporarily. Now, in terms of the timeline of what we are talking about, so if you go back to Yetzias Mitzrayim in the year 2448, 40 years later, because Moshe wouldn't ask for directions while we were lost in the Midbar, we end up with Yehoshua taking over as leader in the year 2488, and then after Yehoshua's passing at the age of 110 in the year 2516, and we're talking now approximately 1,350 years before the Common Era, so something along the lines of 3,400 years ago from today, ushered in the period of the Shoftim, with Osniel ben Kenaz and Ehud ben Gera, many Shoftim, some of whom lasted for a very long time, for about 40 years, or even in the case of Ehud, 80 years as a judge, and some for a very short time, the shortest being Shamgar ben Anas at 6 months, Avimelech, the son of Gidon, the famous defeater of Midian, he lasted 3 years, and eventually in the year 2787, approximately 300 years after the beginning of Yehoshua, comes Ivtzan, who is identified in the Talmud as being Boaz. So we're talking approximately 300 years into the era of the Shoftim, and 100 years before the reign of David HaMelech, the descendant directly of Boaz, as we'll see at the end of the Sefer when we get to Perek Daled. Now, the book of Ruth, therefore, takes place at the same time as Shoftim, but it progresses, says Dr. Ziegler, along a distinctly different trajectory and produces a vastly different situation at its conclusion, where Shoftim describes chaos and lawlessness and sexual immorality. The book of Ruth is very different. It portrays a harmonious and peaceful lifestyle, as opposed to the violent and warring atmosphere of Shoftim. We know that the period of the Shoftim is full of tribalism on the part of the Jews, not one nation working together, one nation with a common goal or a common good, but individual tribes concerned with their own local parochial concerns. So that's why when Sisera, the great general, comes to attack Barak, and Devorah the Neviah helps to save Klal Yisrael, and Yael, the famous woman who hammers a tent peg through his head, the rest of the tribes don't come to the aid of Yisachar and Zevulun, who needed so much help. And Devorah criticizes them greatly in her Shira, the famous Haftorah of Beshalach, where she talks about Reuven and Ephraim being preoccupied with their money and the bleating of their sheep and their cattle and their own lifestyles, and not coming to the aid of their brethren. Disunity, disloyalty, warring tribes like Pilegesh Begiva, where the entire tribe of Binyamin was almost completely wiped out. The terrible story of Pesel Micha, of worshiping idols, and not only that, but the high priest of the idol was the great-grandson of Moshe Rabbeinu himself. Just terrible times for Klal Yisrael. There are some, Rabbi Avigdor Miller most notably, who like to talk about Shoftim as a period that was generally a golden era where everybody worshiped God, and only individual stories, Gidon, Avimelech, Ehud, were stories, Shimshon, of tribes not working together and getting along. He says the fact that over 380 years there are so few incidents shows what a great time in Jewish history it was. But the direct shot of the psukim is really not like that. It's really a time period where each man was out for himself. There's a pasuk that repeats over and over and over again in Sefer Shoftim. And it's the very last pasuk in Sefer Shoftim as well, where it says at the very end, sorry, just trying to bring it up here on screen for myself as I look, it says that in those days, Bayamim Hahem, Ein Melech BiYisrael. There was no king in Yisrael to unite us, to bring us together. Ish hayashar be'enov ya'aseh. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. Selfishness, self-centeredness, rather than worrying about the whole. And so it's a time period of dysfunction. And Dr. Ziegler says that in many ways, as we progress, eventually we progress towards a godly monarchy in the dynasty of Malchus Beis David. The book of Ruth, and again, many apologies, as I said tonight in the live shir, I am going to pronounce it with my Ashkenazic fallback because of my old yeshivish upbringing. So I say Ruth instead of Ruth, as one should, or Ruth, which is the one we can all agree on, the English translation. But Sefer Ruth is outside the Shoftim narrative as a separate book, but it's a tikkun of sorts, not tikkun olam in the conservative and reform sense, where that almost supplants doing mitzvos and observance, but tikkun as in the cosmic tikkun, to show that there was a solution to the chaos and lawlessness of Shoftim, and that would be the midos that are in Rus. And what are those midos? What is the kind of central themes of the book of Rus? So first of all and foremost, chesed and consideration for others, including and especially chesed shel emes, for the deceased, as opposed to Shoftim, where we're all each man out for himself. What we have here is chesed, consideration for others, sharing. A lot of, very Jewish book, in Rus, a lot of the sharing is the sharing of food, where Boaz shares food with Rus, stalks of grain to glean, barley corns when they go on an all-night date, as we will see in Paragimel when the time comes. Faithful social interactions, despite the fact that, as we're going to see, in Shoftim there's tremendous distrust of outsiders and foreigners. So Rus is a Moabiyah, a Moabite woman, and yet Boaz shows hospitality, and Boaz shows chesed towards her. And you contrast that with the Pilegesh Begiva story, where Shevet Binyamin had a stranger come to town, and nobody would take them in. They wouldn't provide them with lodging, they wouldn't provide them with food. They discouraged all outsiders who weren't part of their kin, which sounds an awful lot like Lot and Sodom. The Midah of Sodom is a terrible Midah for a Jewish people to emulate, and we are going to see a lot of connections to Lot and Sodom, because in a book that's predominantly about Moab, that is going to happen. But it also highlights positive leadership by example from Shevet Yehuda. Boaz is a member of Shevet Yehuda who shows the people how to behave religiously, hospitality-wise, welcoming in the foreigner and the almana. The ger and the almana are two categories in the Torah that we are warned more than 17 times not to torment, but also how to be religious in a proper way by following HaKadosh Baruch Hu and speaking of his name. In Sefer Shoftim, it's not spoken of that much. In fact, the Mishkan itself, the religious and national moral center of Klal Yisrael, although it moved from place to place, it stayed in Shiloh for hundreds of years. The Mishkan isn't even mentioned in Sefer Shoftim until the 18th parak of Shoftim, which is kind of embarrassing considering that Shoftim only has 21 chapters, and yet we don't even mention the Mishkan once until parak Yud Ches. And there, it's only placed as a contrast to Pesel Micha, the terrible idol that brought so many Jews astray during a terrible time of the Shoftim. We know that by the time of Elkanah, the father of Shmuel Hanavi, that nobody went on Aliyas HaRegel anymore. I wrote an article about it in the 2022 Kingsway Haggadah, plug, the idea that people didn't bring the Korban Pesach, and that's kind of horrifying, that we've been davening for it for thousands of years, and yet when we had it, we didn't appreciate it. The main themes ultimately lead towards the monarchy of Malchus Beis David, which are going to address all this dysfunction, bring us together in loyalty and fidelity and service of God in a way that Sefer Shoftim, one might despair that we were ever going to reach that point. We're quite literally going to make a united kingdom under David HaMelech. Now, the two geographic locations, and you can look online. I showed a map tonight, but you can look online and see a map of the era of the Shoftim in Eretz Yisrael, and you'll see that on that map, if you go to Shevet Yehuda, which is immediately to the west of the Yam HaMelech, the Dead Sea, if you were to cross the lower Dead Sea in a direct path, which nobody did, you couldn't travel across it easily in those days, you would hit the land of Moab, right next door to the southeast of most of Eretz Yisrael proper. Beis Lechem is in the northerly reaches of Yehuda's Chelek in Eretz Yisrael, and not far from Yerushalayim, of course, as we know if we've gone to Kever Rachel and to places, Bethlehem itself. Christians make their pilgrimages there. We don't go to Beis Lechem very much in the middle of Arab territory in the current life that we live in the land of Israel. But it's not far from Yerushalayim. And most likely, the traveling path from Beis Lechem to Moab would be to go a little bit north of the Yam HaMelech, then down south directly through Ruvain, and eventually to the land of Moab, which was diagonally from upper left to lower right, if you were going in a diagonal direction going down. This journey is one taken at the beginning of Sefer Rus. So now we'll do the 4 psukim that we covered tonight in order, and talking about the pshatim that we learned along the way. Vayihi bimei shvot hashoftim. And it was in the days when the judges judged, or when the judges governed. So Chazal tell us by starting with the word Vayihi, that always portends trouble and tragedy to come. And whenever you start with the phrase Vayihi bimei, which only comes up 5 times in Tanakh in total, that means terrible, trouble, danger, woe, and peril are about to come. So, for example, Vayihi bimei Achashverosh. That is the happy Megillah of Purim, but we forget that the first 5-6 prakim of Megillah Esther are full of the rise of the evil Haman and the terrible peril that it puts the Jewish people into. The party that we went to with Achashverosh, drinking from the Klei HaKodesh from the Beis HaMikdash, Vayihi bimei Achashverosh is not a good start. And here, Vayihi bimei Shvot HaShoftim immediately is going to be followed with the phrase Vayihi Ra'av Ba'aretz, that a terrible famine is going to arise on the land. Why was it such a time of terrible events and bad fate for Klal Yisrael? Because it was an era when Klal Yisrael was not behaving well during the times of the Shoftim. Medrash Rus says that one interpretation of Shvot HaShoftim means it's a time when many judges judged. So you have Barak and Devorah and Shamgar and Ehud prior to the period eventually of Ibtzan. So many judges came and went. But the Talmudic opinion, as Rashi points out, is that Ibtzan was Boaz, identified in Bava Basra. So this is 70 years after Devorah, and some almost 300 years into the period of the Shoftim, 280 years into the period of the Shoftim. But Shvot HaShoftim, if you read it literally, means not in the days the judges judged, but Shvot HaShoftim in the days when people judged the judges, the days of the judging of the judges. So what does that mean? So the Midrash explains, Oy ledar sheshaftu es shofteihem. Woe to the generation that passed judgment on their leaders, on their judges. And va'oy ledar sheshoftav tzrichin lehi shafet. Woe to the generation that their judges deserve to be judged negatively by the people. So the Malbim says there was no one national judge that was honorable and trustworthy. What you had instead were multiplicity of local judges elected through corrupt means, and none of whom commanded respect from even their local constituents, let alone the people as a whole. This is a time period of sharp decline after Yehoshua takes away national leadership. And so the local judges were just as corrupt as the people were, which unfortunately is saying quite a lot. The corrupt nation was judging their corrupt judges, Shvot HaShoftim. The Medrash tells us that if a judge would sit and expound on psukim and dvarim like lo satem mishpat, do not pervert justice, then the crowd would shout out, but we've seen you pervert justice on a regular basis. If he would try to teach in a shiur, lo sakir panim, do not accept bribes, he was blatantly taking bribery under the table from people to rule on their behalf. These judges were terribly corrupt, and even those who weren't had terribly human flaws. Shimshon Hagibor, the Jewish superhero, the super strong man, actually had all kinds of personal weaknesses, particularly marrying Goyish women, marrying shiksas, as we would say. He went after Plishti women, 3 of them. Difference of opinion whether he converted them or not before marrying them. Gidon was very self-centered after his miraculous victory over Midian, and he kind of withdrew and let the people go astray, and Avodah Zarah boomed in his own family after he passed away. People said in the Mefarshim that if a judge pointed out a small offense, the accused would say, well, but you committed something worse just last week. If a judge ordered Malchus, a flogging, the offender would turn around, grab the whip, and flog the judge instead. Violent offenders were never convicted because of fears of reprisal. Think about bail reform laws in New York and what that's led to in lawlessness and chaos. We're living through this same Zman, so it's small wonder that the next words in the Pasuk Aleph, Vayihi Ra'av Ba'aretz. And so there was a famine in the land. Again, Vayihi, not just a physical famine, but a spiritual famine, a generation that didn't live by the Torah. So the people suffering, potentially dying, starving of famine, immediately turned to the wealthy men of their generations, the Parnasei Hador, and begged them and maybe even forced them to supply their needs. And who did they turn to? So they turned to the next words in the Pasuk, Vayelech ish mi Beis Lechem Yehuda. There was an Ish, a great man of Beis Lechem Yehuda, Elimelech, who's not even named yet in the Pasuk. Personal wealth, leadership qualities, thought of himself as being royalty for reasons we'll see in the next Pasuk. He came from Yehuda. And yet, Vayelech ish mi Beis Lechem Yehuda. He fled, Vayelech, he ran away, deserted the people, demoralizing them. And not only that, but the city of Beis Lechem Yehuda were all of not just his friends, but his relatives in their ancestral portions. So he's abandoning his own impoverished family, abandoning his tribe, abandoning his clan, which is why he would be punished. He is identified as an anonymous man who left, and the Medrash says, what was he, just a dead stump, unattached to the community he left? And the answer the Medrash gives is yes, by running away from Eretz Yisrael at a time of overwhelming need. He's unattached, he's uprooted, he's a dead stump as far as it's concerned. And we're going to see he's going to leave behind no children, although he has 2 children. They're not going to live long, and so he's going to leave no legacy behind. So he runs away from Eretz Yisrael, Lagur B'stei Moav, ashamed of the insult and derision he would endure for deserting his impoverished homeland. He headed for Moav, down to the southeast. Moav, unfortunately, is an entire nation renowned for being stingy. They wouldn't give lechem v'mayim to the Jewish people in the Midbar when we desperately need it. Terribly objectionable. Doesn't help that, keep in mind, they descend from Lot, who Avraham gave everything to. So they owed us. They were hypocrites. But he went to live in Moab with the stingy people because he himself was one. But he went Lagur to temporarily live, to dwell briefly in Sedei Moab in the fields. He wasn't going to set down roots in the cities. Theoretically, maybe he was going to return home. Hu v'ishto u'shnei banav. He and his wife and his 2 sons, none of whom are named in this first pasuk. Was it his leadership that took them there? Was it a family decision that everybody agreed with? It's hard to tell. But away they went, Vayihi Yusham. That's coming up next. And he and his wife and 2 sons went there. All 3 times in this pasuk we have Vai, woe. Vai yehi bimei. Woe in those days when there was a moral tragedy in the generation. Vayihi ra'av. Woe to the economic conditions that faced the people of Beis Lechem Yehuda. And finally, Vayelech. Woe to the failure of leadership that removed hope and departed and ran off. Pasuk Beis v'shem hoyesh Elimelech. And finally, now he gets a name, and the name of the man was Elimelech. He was known as Elimelech because he used to say, Eli tavo malchus. Malchus will come to me. Eli malchus, Elimelech. Yaakov Avinu had blessed Yehuda, lo yosor shevet mi Yehuda, with kingship and rule over the 12 Shvatim. The tribal leadership went through Yehuda to his son Peretz, and then through Nachshon ben Aminadav, the famous Nasi who jumped into the Yam Suf and showed great faith in Hashem splitting the sea. And Elimelech, descended from Nachshon ben Aminadav, thought of himself as the latest nobleman who would someday be king. Unfortunately, the man who would be king by running away from Eretz Yisrael and abandoning the people to poverty and starvation removed himself from consideration for kingship because of his moral lapse and laxitude that he had. It was, in fact, the man from the same lineage who would be noble, would be Boaz, who we will meet later in Parak Beis. B'shem ishto Naomi, and the name of his wife was Naomi, and the Medrash says because her deeds were na'im, pleasant, u'ni'imim, and sweet. She was a wise, kind, good woman, but she too picked up and ran when her husband left. B'shem banav Machlon v'chilyon, and the name of his two sons, same Shem Shnei banav, they're presented as a unit because they really didn't distinguish from each other. They had the same characteristics. They were selfish. They were greedy, unfortunately, like their father seemed to be. And furthermore, their names, Machlon, says the Medrash, from Shenimchu min ha'olam. They would be blotted out, Machui, erased from the world. And Kilyon, Shekalu min ha'olam. They would be completely destroyed from the world with no imprint, legacy, or sign that they had been there. No children after them, nobody to carry on their name. And yet they started out as Ephrasim, an honorific title, as aristocrats. From Ephrasi, distinguished persons, Rashi says. They trace their lineage back to Miriam Hanaviah, who was called Ephrasa in Divrei Hayamim, who married Kalev ben Yefuneh and had wonderful children. But unfortunately, these latest wonderful children, they had all the virtues essential for kingship. Wealth, Elimelech, wisdom, Naomi, eminent lineage, Machlon and Kilyon, but it availed nothing once they ran off. And so, Mi Beis Lechem Yehuda, they originated from Beis Lechem Yehuda, which they abandoned in its time of need. Vayavo Sidei Moav, and they came to the fields of Moab, just as we said before. But now, Vayihiyu Sham. Instead of simply Lagur, to transitionally live there temporarily, now Vayihiyu B'stei Moav. They stayed there. And not only that, Vayihiyu means that they became there. They became wealthy, eminent citizens. They became big shots. They became assimilated into the Moavi values and culture of stinginess and inhospitality, reinforcing their own tendencies in that direction. Like seeks out like, and unfortunately in this case, they sought out the wrong kind of thing to be like. So therefore, what comes next in Pasuk Gimel is tragedy. Vayamas Elimelech ish Naomi. So Elimelech died an untimely death, punished for his terribly selfish behavior, for neglecting to even daven or beg for mercy from Hashem for his generation. And by the time he died, Ish Naomi, he wasn't a Gevir at all. He wasn't Elimelech ben anybody. He was just the husband of Naomi. The man who would be king was now only Naomi's husband, mourned only by the wife, devastated at his death. Vatishaer hi ushne vaneha. And she was left over like shiare menachos, like remnants of the meal offerings, the Gemara says. Little consequence, few resources. And she was left over. She remained with her two sons. But the Gemara also says that this is a criticism, because this was a golden opportunity to return Eretz Yisrael now. Her husband, who made the primary decision to go to Moab, is dead. Turn back, go home. Go back and help your generation, or at least suffer among them. But instead, Vatisha she chose to remain. And her Shnei Vaneha would pay the price, because with the passing of Elimelech, they become her sons. They're not identified with Elimelech. He leaves nothing behind. But at the same time, now she is responsible for the fact that they do the greatest assimilative act possible. Pasuk Daled, Vayisu lahem noshim moavios. The greatest, worst act that a Jew who is part of the covenant can do is to marry out. Even generations of Americans who were completely non-religious understood this. But they married Moabite women. Nashim Moavios. Being so preeminent among Gentiles leads to assimilation. They marry Moabite women. It does not say that they converted them. They didn't insist that they follow the mitzvos. They didn't insist that they become Jewish. They didn't immerse themselves in a mikveh for that purpose. Rabbi Meir says this is the Avera for which Machlon Nechilion would be punished and have to die. Because Vayisu lohem Nashim Moavios. They married for themselves Moabite women. Not for progeny, not for continuing their families, but to give in to their own desires for what they wanted. Pretty, prominent, Goyisha women to have as their wives. And as such, by marrying them for their own benefit, they would be punished. Shem Ha'achas Orpah. The one wife was named Orpah. More about what that name means next time on Wednesday when we meet up for the next year. Tuesday night, of course, we won't be having because of the Kingsway Women's Program. That's going to be great in person in the Shmorg Room on Tuesday night. If you're listening to this, please go if you are a woman or identify as one. V'shem Hashenis Rus, another name pregnant with meaning. The name of the second was Rus, Vayeshvu Sham Ke'eser Shanim. And they lived there for about 10 years, give or take, but it didn't matter. They dwelled there, Vayeshvu Sham, not sojourners, but people living there, during which time neither couple produces any children. According strictly to halacha, if one doesn't produce children in 10 years, one is supposed to get divorced. So they actually are disobeying this aspect of halacha as well. And moreover, they're watching their carefully cultivated wealth evaporate. The business dropped off, the Medrash tells us. Then their livestock died. In order, first horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, and then Elimelech. So all this started before Elimelech even died. An escalating punishment and a message to repent that the family is ignoring. From famine and poverty in Eretz Yisrael to impoverishment in Moab. Running away gained them nothing and cost them everything. And marrying into Moab is even worse, and we will see why on Wednesday night as we continue with a little of Pasuk Daled, but really trying to hustle into Pasuk Hey, Vav, and etc. We are trying to do 7 or 8 psukim a night. Unfortunately, tonight, with my little intro, we only did 4, but we're going to try to work our way up and finish all of Megillas Rus in 3 weeks if we possibly can. It's a challenge, but I have high hopes. So thank you for listening to this recording if you're listening. I apologize for not including the gasps and awe and shock of the live audience, which actually was pretty quiet tonight. I set up a wall of sound and nobody interrupted me. So maybe this is almost as good to hear the recorded version of the live shir. Have a wonderful night. See you on Wednesday, May 3rd.